The View never saw this coming. For weeks, The View's hosts have laughed off the $800 million lawsuit filed against them by Karoline Leavitt. At first, it seemed like nothing more than another attention-seeking stunt, an empty threat from a conservative figure who had a bone to pick with the show. They thought they could dismiss it, joke about it, and move on. But what they didn't realize was that this lawsuit was far from over. It wasn't just another attempt to grab headlines. Behind the scenes, something much darker was unfolding. Documents were being leaked, emails surfaced, and suddenly, The View found itself facing a storm they couldn't control. Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit was now threatening to expose something far bigger than a simple defamation claim. The stakes were no longer about one woman fighting back. This was the beginning of a battle that could bring down an empire. For weeks, the hosts of The View seemed to treat Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit as a joke. Whoopi Goldberg, with her usual air of confidence, mocked the claim without hesitation. She rolled her eyes, made a dismissive comment about how the lawsuit was just another conservative tactic to make headlines, and laughed it off. "Please, we've dealt with worse than this," she said on air, as if this lawsuit was nothing more than a passing storm that would blow over in a few days. Joy Behar wasn't far behind in her scornful assessment. She scoffed at the entire ordeal, rolling her eyes and declaring it a desperate attempt by someone who simply wanted attention. "It's not even worth discussing," she added, her tone dripping with contempt. For her, this was just another conservative trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. There was no real threat here, or so she thought. Sunny Hostin, the legal expert of the group, joined in with a confident smirk. As someone who regularly dealt with legal matters on the show, she assumed the case would be thrown out immediately. She leaned into her legal background, predicting with certainty that this was just another frivolous case. "She doesn't have a leg to stand on," Sunny declared, her voice full of authority. "This will be over in a week." The message was clear from the hosts. Karoline Leavitt didn't stand a chance. The media backed up their confidence, with outlets like CNN and MSNBC labeling the lawsuit a baseless attack on free speech. For days, the narrative was the same. The View wasn't worried. This lawsuit would be dismissed without a second thought. Public perception mirrored their views. The lawsuit was brushed off as an act of desperation. There was no sense of urgency, no reason for concern. The View and its hosts were in control, and the storm that was brewing seemed a long way off. To the casual observer, it seemed like just another conservative controversy meant to grab attention. They all thought the lawsuit was a fleeting issue. Little did they know, things were about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. At first, The View's reaction to Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit had been one of laughter, mockery, and dismissal. But something began to shift behind the scenes, a quiet ripple of panic that grew louder by the day. Internal emails, memos, and financial records started leaking out of ABC's network like cracks in a dam, and what had once seemed like an ordinary defamation case suddenly felt much more dangerous. The first leaks appeared innocuously enough. Emails exchanged between The View's producers and their public relations team. At a glance, these didn't seem like much. Small talk about press releases, planning for upcoming shows, and some general strategy for handling the lawsuit. But it wasn't long before the scope of the leaks grew. More and more emails started to surface, some concerning questionable financial transactions, and others that mentioned undisclosed meetings with political figures. Each new leak raised the stakes. At first, the hosts of The View remained confident, their dismissive attitudes still apparent on air. But inside the network, there was a growing sense that something much bigger was unfolding. What began as a series of harmless emails turned into a cascading flood of damaging information, threatening to unravel the very fabric of The View's existence. By now, ABC's top executives were beginning to feel the pressure. This wasn't just a political skirmish anymore. It wasn't even just a legal issue. The leaks had exposed something darker, more insidious. With each new document that surfaced, it became clearer that the lawsuit wasn't just about a conservative personality fighting back. It was about the dark web of influence and corruption lurking beneath the surface of mainstream media. The hosts of The View had no idea what was coming. They had laughed off the lawsuit as a joke, but the tide was turning, and the weight of their arrogance was starting to become impossible to ignore. The View was no longer just facing a PR battle. They were caught in something far deeper and far more dangerous than they ever could have imagined. As the leaks continued, the documents that surfaced grew more alarming. What was once just a handful of seemingly inconsequential emails quickly spiraled into a massive expose. ABC executives were beginning to panic. What if these documents reached the public? What if the full extent of the network's connections to powerful political figures and corporate elites was exposed? Leaked financial documents detailed undisclosed transactions between the View's producers and political figures, meetings that were never officially logged, deals that were never publicly disclosed. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just the View's content that had been influenced. It was the way stories were chosen, framed, and presented to the public. These weren't isolated incidents. They pointed to a much larger network of influence. Internal memos outlined strategies for controlling narratives, including efforts to suppress or downplay specific stories in favor of others that aligned with certain political agendas. Some emails even discussed coordination between the network's executives and high-ranking political figures. The documents revealed a carefully orchestrated campaign to manipulate public perception, and the more they leaked, the worse it looked for ABC. At first, it seemed like these were just the kind of leaks one could expect from any corporate environment. Minor mistakes, bits of information that, when taken out of context, didn't seem like a big deal. But as more emails, memos, and documents emerged, it became clear this was no longer about a defamation lawsuit. This was an orchestrated effort by some of the most powerful players in the media and politics to control what the public saw, heard, and believed. The network's legal team had initially brushed it off as a nuisance, but now they were scrambling. The View's hosts had no idea that what seemed like a minor legal inconvenience had become a full-scale corporate crisis. The deeper the leaks went, the more the network's powerful allies began to feel the heat. It wasn't just about fighting a lawsuit anymore. It was about trying to contain a growing scandal that threatened to expose the entire media system. As more leaks emerged, the media narrative began to shift. What started as a lawsuit for defamation was now an investigation into something much darker: corporate corruption, media manipulation, and political interference. What had seemed like an isolated case involving the View's questionable actions was now a case study in how the media industry and political figures worked together to shape the narrative. The first reports came from conservative outlets, but soon, independent journalists and major news networks began picking up the story. They dug into the leaked documents, uncovering a web of hidden power structures that had been manipulating not only The View, but other major networks as well. The revelations were explosive. It was no longer just about what had happened behind the scenes of The View. It was about how much influence these networks were willing to wield to control the flow of information. As more of these emails and memos were analyzed, it became clear that the manipulation went far beyond what the public had known. Political figures had been working hand in hand with media executives to decide which stories were told, which ones were buried, and how the public would be made to believe in one narrative over another. This wasn't just media bias. This was coordinated, deliberate control of information, with powerful figures calling the shots behind the scenes. But as the documents began to paint a more disturbing picture, the FBI started to take an interest. What had started as a legal battle over defamation was now a federal investigation into media corruption. The government's involvement meant that The View and ABC were no longer facing just public outrage. They were facing the very real possibility of criminal charges. The stakes were now higher than anyone could have predicted. The investigation threatened to expose not only ABC's corrupt practices, but also the larger media system that had been manipulating public opinion for years. What had begun as a trivial lawsuit was now a major political and corporate scandal, and the entire media world was watching. If the investigation reached its full potential, it could expose the most powerful media figures in the world, and The View was at the center of it all. The atmosphere in the View studio had completely shifted. What was once a relaxed, confident environment had quickly turned into a pressure cooker. The hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, and Sunny Hostin, who had once mocked Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit with laughter and dismissive comments, now appeared visibly uncomfortable. Whoopi, the show's anchor, was the first to show cracks in her confidence. On air, she struggled to maintain the familiar, carefree tone that had always been her trademark. She tried to brush off the growing controversy, but her body language betrayed her. Her eyes darted around the studio more than usual, and her typically relaxed posture was now stiff and defensive. When she spoke, her words seemed more forced, lacking the usual conviction. "We've been through worse," Whoopi muttered, but there was a noticeable hesitation in her voice, as if she were trying to convince herself more than the audience. Joy Behar, known for her biting humor and quick wit, was also starting to feel the weight of the situation. Her usual eye-rolling dismissals were gone, replaced by a strained smile. She'd always prided herself on being unflappable, but today, she looked anything but. When the topic of the lawsuit came up, Joy's tone lacked its usual sarcasm. She struggled to keep her composure, even when the producers tried to inject humor into the segment. "This is ridiculous. It's just one person looking for attention," she said, but the words felt empty, lacking the usual spark. Sunny Hostin, the legal analyst, was perhaps the most affected. She had predicted the lawsuit would be dismissed, confidently stating that Leavitt didn't have a leg to stand on. Now, she couldn't even meet the camera's gaze. She tried to shift the narrative, but her earlier certainty had vanished. "We're just focused on what's right, and the legal system will take care of this," she said, though her forced optimism didn't convince anyone watching. Her hands were shaking slightly, her body language revealing just how much the pressure was getting to her. Each host's attempt to play off the mounting tension only made it clearer that they were no longer in control. The jokes had stopped, replaced by an underlying sense of anxiety that was palpable to anyone who watched closely. They were realizing that the lawsuit wasn't just going to disappear, it was far bigger than they had anticipated, and they were caught in the middle. As the tension behind the scenes grew, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Social media erupted, and the backlash against The View was relentless. Memes and viral tweets flooded the internet, mocking the hosts for their earlier dismissive behavior. A meme featuring Whoopi Goldberg's awkward shrug and Joy Behar's eye roll went viral, accompanied by captions like, "When you think you're untouchable, but the truth catches up with you." Twitter users flooded the platform with hashtags like #TheViewIsCrumbling and #ByTheView. Clips from the show, where the hosts had belittled Leavitt and laughed off her lawsuit, were clipped and reposted across various platforms. The contrast between their earlier mocking demeanor and their current discomfort was impossible to ignore. The public was no longer sympathizing with The View. They were actively turning against the show, accusing the hosts of hypocrisy and arrogance. The backlash didn't just stay online. It became a hot topic in other media outlets. Conservative commentators and independent media joined in, amplifying the mockery. How The View went from mocking Karoline Leavitt to begging for her to drop the lawsuit became a trending headline on multiple news sites. The story was no longer about Leavitt. It was about the growing realization that The View had become a symbol of media manipulation, corporate arrogance, and political influence. The hosts tried to maintain their composure, but the public's anger was undeniable. Their past behavior was now being dissected on every platform, and every attempt to downplay the situation only fueled the fire. The internet's reaction had become a force of its own, one that the hosts could no longer ignore. This online backlash only worsened the hosts' already growing panic. They couldn't control the narrative anymore. They had underestimated the power of social media and the public's ability to expose their hypocrisy. The View is no longer just dealing with a legal battle. They were facing a public relations disaster that threatened their entire brand. In a last-ditch effort to save face, the hosts of The View made a public plea. On air, Whoopi, Joy, and Sunny appeared more subdued than usual, trying to sound reasonable, calm, and conciliatory. "We've all had our disagreements, but we need to take a step back here," Whoopi said, her voice lacking its usual conviction. She glanced nervously at her co-hosts, trying to maintain the show's signature lighthearted tone, but it was clear that the earlier laughter had faded. Joy chimed in, her usual sharpness dulled. "I think we need to talk this through, find a way to move forward," she said, her words sounding more like a rehearsed script than a genuine attempt at reconciliation. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sunny, ever the legal voice of reason, tried to frame the conversation in terms of legal professionalism, but her words felt hollow. "Maybe we can resolve this without dragging it through the courts," she said, but her hesitation was palpable. There was no firm conviction in her tone, just a desperate plea to avoid further fallout. The public could see right through it. The hosts were no longer in control of the narrative. Their forced attempts to appear calm and reasonable were in stark contrast to their previous dismissals of the lawsuit. The desperation was evident in every word, every glance exchanged between them. The audience was no longer buying the act. The hosts' efforts to salvage their image were falling apart in real time. The damage had been done. Their mocking behavior and confident dismissals had made them look arrogant and out of touch, and no amount of public pleading could erase the reality. Behind the scenes at ABC, the executives were scrambling. The situation had quickly spiraled from a minor PR issue into a full-blown corporate disaster. Meetings were held in secret, with panic starting to set in at the highest levels of the network. The internal leaks had exposed more than just a frivolous lawsuit. They had revealed the deep ties between the network, political figures, and powerful corporate interests. The network's legal team tried to spin the situation as best they could, but the leaks were too damaging. The executives were now caught between a rock and a hard place. Should they continue defending the View, doubling down on their public stance, or should they cut their losses and pull the plug on the show before the situation got worse? There were arguments in the boardroom. Some executives felt that keeping the View on air was essential for the brand survival. Others, however, believed that the damage to ABC's reputation was too severe. They couldn't ignore the growing public backlash, and the lawsuit's potential to unravel the entire media empire was becoming impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, a decision was being made, one that could change the future of The View and the entire network. As the leaked documents continued to pour in, ABC executives were hit with the reality of just how severe the situation had become. What had started as a simple lawsuit against The View was now rapidly escalating into a full-scale corporate crisis. The leaks revealed more than just financial mismanagement or questionable practices. They exposed deep, behind-the-scenes connections between The View, powerful political figures, and corporate interests. What seemed like an isolated issue was now part of a much larger, more dangerous web of influence, and the consequences were quickly becoming impossible to ignore. The stakes were no longer limited to a lawsuit. The very existence of The View was in jeopardy. Internal emails and memos had exposed coordinated efforts to manipulate media narratives and influence public opinion. These revelations were damning, and the possibility that they could lead to a federal investigation sent shockwaves through ABC's boardrooms. Executives who had once shrugged off the lawsuit as a minor inconvenience were now suddenly aware that they could be implicated in a much broader scandal. The network wasn't just fighting a defamation suit. It was now fighting for its survival. Behind closed doors, the mood shifted from one of denial to frantic action. Meetings were called at all levels of the company, with ABC's leadership scrambling to contain the damage. The legal team was working around the clock, trying to figure out how to mitigate the fallout. Senior executives, who had once been confident that they could ride out the storm, were now questioning their own decisions. They had underestimated the scale of the leaks, and now they were faced with the possibility that the situation was beyond their control. There was no clear solution in sight, and the pressure was mounting. The executives who had once been in control were now desperately trying to regain it. But the internal panic was palpable. What had begun as a small public relations issue was now threatening to become a full-blown corporate disaster that could alter the course of ABC's future. As the internal crisis deepened, ABC's legal team began to realize that the situation was far more serious than they had initially thought. The lawsuit, which had once seemed like a straightforward defamation case, was now intertwined with much deeper issues. The leaked emails and internal memos revealed financial dealings that were far from innocent. These weren't just minor mistakes or missteps. These were coordinated efforts to suppress or manipulate information that had the potential to spark a federal investigation. The legal risks were enormous. The possibility that ABC could be implicated in a larger scheme of media manipulation and political influence was now a very real threat. The network's legal team knew that if these documents were introduced in court or released to the public, the consequences could be catastrophic. It wasn't just about losing the lawsuit anymore. It was about whether ABC's actions would land them in the crosshairs of a much larger investigation. If that happened, ABC could be facing criminal charges and even government intervention. Financially, the impact was just as severe. The damage to ABC's reputation was already significant, and it was only getting worse. Sponsorships were being pulled, advertising deals were starting to fall through, and ratings for The View were plummeting. The network had long relied on its strong relationship with advertisers and corporate sponsors, but now, with public trust eroding, those deals were at risk of collapsing. The financial strain from these potential losses was becoming unbearable. ABC was no longer in control of the narrative, and its once reliable cash flow was now jeopardized by the scandal that was unfolding. The network's bottom line was under attack from all sides, and the executives knew that if the crisis wasn't contained soon, the financial fallout could be disastrous. As the situation at ABC worsened, a conversation began to emerge behind closed doors that no one had ever anticipated: the possibility of canceling The View altogether. The show, which had once been a staple of daytime television and a significant revenue generator for ABC, was now at the center of a growing scandal that threatened to bring down the network itself. The leaked documents, the public backlash, and the mounting financial and legal risks all pointed to one uncomfortable truth: The View had become more of a liability than an asset. Senior executives began to question whether the long-term damage to the network was worth the continued airing of the show. The internal power struggle within ABC intensified. On one side, executives who had worked with The View for years argued that the show was still a valuable asset, with a strong, loyal audience that generated significant revenue through advertisements and sponsorships. But on the other side, there were those who felt that the cost of keeping The View on air was simply too high. They believed that continuing to air the show, given its connection to the scandal, would only deepen the network's crisis and tarnish its reputation even further. The debate over The View's future became a defining issue within the network. For the first time, ABC executives were seriously considering pulling the plug on one of their most popular shows. It wasn't an easy decision. The View had been a cornerstone of ABC's programming for years, but the network's leadership realized that the larger corporate interests were at risk. With the possibility of a federal investigation looming and the financial fallout from the scandal growing, the executives knew that something had to give. In the end, the decision came down to protecting ABC's larger interests. Cutting The View loose, painful as it was, might be the only way to prevent further damage to the network as a whole. But making that decision would come with its own set of consequences, and ABC's leadership was well aware that the fallout from canceling the show could spark a new round of public outrage and backlash. For weeks, Karoline Leavitt had remained eerily silent. When the lawsuit was first filed, many dismissed it as a fleeting stunt, a conservative voice trying to make waves. But as the scandal surrounding The View deepened, Karoline's silence became one of her most powerful tools. She didn't respond to the media. She didn't engage with any offers or settlement talks. She simply let the situation unfold, choosing to allow the pressure to mount on The View and ABC, unperturbed by the chaos swirling around her. Her silence was not an accident. It was a deliberate and calculated power play. Karoline understood that by not responding, she could let the situation escalate without exerting any effort on her part. She knew that every leak, every new revelation from the internal documents would further expose The View and ABC's secrets. Instead of fighting back, she allowed the media and public to do the heavy lifting for her. Every article, every tweet, and every viral post criticizing The View only made her case stronger. Her legal team, well aware of the growing tide, worked in the background, quietly gathering evidence, preparing for the next move. But Karoline's choice to remain silent was more than just strategic. It was psychological warfare. The longer she stayed quiet, the more The View and ABC panicked. They were left to speculate about her next move. Was she planning a major press conference? A new round of legal action? Or was she simply letting the media run with it until the network imploded under the weight of its own secrets? This silence was not passive. It was active and intentional. While The View's hosts were losing control, Karoline remained calm, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The host's earlier mockery had now been replaced by uncertainty. Each day that passed without Karoline speaking was another day that The View's executives and hosts spent in growing fear. They no longer knew what to expect from her. Karoline's silence had become her most effective weapon. As Karoline Leavitt's silence continued, the power dynamic between her and the view shifted dramatically. What had started as a one-sided battle, where the hosts of The View dismissed her lawsuit with arrogance, was now turning in Karoline's favor. She was no longer the figure that was mocked and belittled. She was the one in control. The hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, and Sunny Hostin, who had once laughed off her legal challenge, were now trapped in their own panic. Every time they tried to regain control of the narrative, it backfired. Their attempts at damage control were falling flat, their forced apologies and public pleas only making them look weaker. The media was no longer on their side. The once comfortable and dismissive tone on air had been replaced by a palpable sense of dread. The hosts had lost the confidence they once exuded. In contrast, Karoline stood firm, never wavering in her approach. While the hosts were scrambling to stay afloat, she remained composed, almost serene in her power. The media and public had begun to view her as the underdog who had outlasted the storm. Every day she remained silent was another day The View lost ground, inching closer to a potential collapse. Karoline wasn't just a figure in the lawsuit. She was a symbol of resilience, patience, and strategy. The power shift was stark. Where The View's hosts had once been untouchable, confidently mocking Karoline and brushing off the lawsuit, they were now scrambling to regain their position. Karoline, through her silence, had shown that she didn't need to engage in petty arguments or make public statements. She let her legal team handle the groundwork while the media amplified her message, allowing the crisis to grow on its own. As The View struggled to recover, Karoline's strategic move began to bear fruit. It was no longer a battle of words or claims. It was about control. Karoline, by staying silent, had taken the reins of the situation, turning The View's earlier overconfidence into a self-inflicted weakness. The hosts were losing, and Karoline was winning, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. In a desperate bid to stop the escalating crisis, The View finally went on air with an unprecedented public plea. Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, and Sunny Hostin, once so confident in their dismissal of Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit, now appeared noticeably uncomfortable. They had tried everything to downplay the situation, but the mounting pressure was beginning to crack their composure. The tone on the show had shifted. Gone were the laughs and sarcastic remarks that had characterized the earlier broadcasts. Now, they tried to appear calm, reasonable, and understanding, but their desperation was clear. Whoopi opened the segment with a forced smile, her voice shaky, trying to project a sense of calm that didn't match her body language. "We've been in this business a long time, and we know how to navigate disagreements," Whoopi said, her words meant to sound conciliatory. But there was no warmth behind them, just an uncomfortable attempt to avoid further confrontation. Joy followed up, but her usual sharpness was gone. She spoke slowly, carefully, like someone walking on eggshells. "Look, we can all agree this situation has gotten out of hand," she said, forcing a smile. "We don't need to be at odds with anyone, especially not over something like this. We just want peace and resolution." Her words felt rehearsed, as though she was reading from script written by someone else. There was no genuine conviction behind her attempt at diplomacy. Sunny Hostin, ever the legal analyst, struggled the most. She had been so confident earlier in dismissing the case, but now she could barely keep her composure. "We've always prided ourselves on seeking justice and truth," Sunny said, her voice strained. "This situation, however, needs to be handled with respect. Let's work together to find a solution." But the sincerity of her words was drowned out by the awkwardness that hung in the air. She wasn't offering a resolution. She was begging. The audience, which had once been loyal and supportive, could sense the dissonance. The hosts, who had long been seen as untouchable figures, were now visibly shaken, trying to convince everyone that they were still in control of the situation. The sudden shift was jarring, and viewers couldn't help but notice how forced their gestures and words were. The discomfort was palpable, and the audience wasn't buying it. What had once been a well-rehearsed show of confidence was now a desperate attempt at damage control. The internet, of course, wasted no time in picking apart the host's public plea. Social media exploded in real time, with memes, viral tweets, and video clips mocking The View's desperation. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. The same hosts who had mocked Karoline Leavitt for weeks belittling her lawsuit and laughing at her expense, were now begging her to drop the case. The contrast was stark, and the internet let them have it. Memes flooded platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, showcasing clips of Whoopi, Joy, and Sunny's forced kindness. One meme juxtaposed Whoopi's earlier laughter with a screenshot of her nervously tapping her fingers on the table during the public plea, captioned, "When you realize you've lost control of the narrative." Another meme features still from Joy's attempt to sound reasonable, with a caption, "How to say we're sorry without actually meaning it." Tweets began to flood the timeline, with users pointing out the glaring hypocrisy. "So this is what happens when you mock someone for weeks, and then realize they weren't joking," one tweet read, accompanied by a clip of Whoopi shrugging dismissively earlier in the week, followed by her awkward attempt at an apology on air. Another tweet read, "The View now begging Karoline to drop the lawsuit?" The irony is too rich. Even popular conservative pundits shared clips of the host's attempt at reconciliation, tearing apart the sincerity of their words. The viral explosion wasn't just a few posts. It was a full-on internet storm. What had once been a scandal confined to ABC was now front-page news across social media, with memes and clips circulating faster than the network could control. Despite their best efforts, The View's public plea fell flat. The damage to their credibility had already been done. The apology wasn't genuine. It felt forced, as if the hosts were reading lines from a script. Viewers, including even some of their most loyal fans, began to turn on them. The same public who had once supported The View now saw through the veneer of their apology. What had once been a respected show was now being viewed as insincere, manipulative, and desperate. Even the fans who had been on the show's side began to question its authenticity. Comments flooded social media, calling out the hosts for their hypocrisy. "First you mocked her. Now you want her to drop the lawsuit? Pathetic," one commenter posted, reflecting the growing sentiment. They thought they were untouchable, but now they look scared. It's not working anymore. What started as a lawsuit was now an indictment of The View's own behavior. The host had tried to control the narrative, but the public backlash was now far beyond their ability to repair. The apology had been the final nail in the coffin. No amount of forced kindness could undo the damage. The public had made up its mind, and The View was on the losing side. The moment The View's public plea fell flat, Karoline Leavitt knew it was time to take control of the situation once and for all. Without hesitation, she released a final statement on social media that would shift the entire narrative. "I'm not just suing The View. I'm suing the entire system that has protected them for years," she posted. This single declaration sent shockwaves through the media world. It wasn't just about one show, one lawsuit, or even just The View's controversial behavior anymore. Karoline was taking aim at a much larger, deeply entrenched system, one that had been manipulating public perception and controlling narratives for years. This was about systemic corruption in the media industry, about hidden power structures that had long shielded the truth from the public. The statement changed everything. No longer was Karoline just the plaintiff in a lawsuit. She had become the voice of those seeking to expose the darker side of the media industry. Her words resonated with many who had felt that the media had been compromised for far too long. Karoline's decision to move beyond the lawsuit and challenge the very institutions that had protected The View shifted the public's focus from a legal battle to a broader conversation about transparency, accountability, and media control. The media outlets that had once ridiculed her were now scrambling to catch up. The legal teams, the PR firms, and the executives at ABC had underestimated the power of Karoline's words. What was once an isolated case now had the potential to be a national reckoning. Karoline's message went viral almost instantly. As the statement spread across social media, the executives at ABC were in full-blown panic mode. The statement wasn't just about one show anymore. It was an existential threat to the entire network. The stakes had skyrocketed, and The View was now at the center of a much larger storm. Inside ABC's headquarters, the mood was frantic. Executives who had initially brushed off the lawsuit as a minor PR issue now realized the severity of the situation. This wasn't just a lawsuit they were dealing with. It was a challenge to the very foundation of the media empire they had spent years building. Karoline's words had exposed the system that had shielded The View and other media giants for decades. Now, ABC was scrambling to prevent a full-blown collapse. The idea that their carefully constructed narrative could fall apart was now a terrifying reality. Their deep ties to political figures, their manipulation of public perception, and their influence on the media landscape were all under intense scrutiny. ABC now had to face the possibility that the world was watching, and that their empire, built on secrecy and influence, was crumbling. The reality had finally hit ABC. The View and its executives had once thought they controlled the narrative, that they could manipulate public opinion and push back against anyone who challenged them. But now, with Karoline's statement ringing through the media, the world was watching them crumble. What had begun as a defamation lawsuit had morphed into something far more dangerous. Karoline wasn't just fighting for herself. She was exposing a corrupt system that had hidden behind the walls of the media industry for far too long. The question now was, will ABC survive this reckoning, or will the truth about the system they built come crashing down?